Short History of the World by H. G. Wells, written in 1922. Chapter number 21. The Early History of the Jews. And now we can tell of the Hebrews, a Semitic people, not so important in their own time as in their influence upon the later history of the world. They were settled in Judea long before 1,000 years before Christ, and their capital city after that time was Jerusalem. Their story is interwoven with that of the great empires on either side of them, Egypt to the south, and the changing empires of Syria, Assyria, and Babylon to the north. Their country was an inevitable high road between these latter powers and Egypt. Their importance to the world is due to the fact that they produce a written literature, a world history, a collection of laws, chronicles, psalms, books of wisdom, poetry and fiction, and political utterances which became at last what Christians know as the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. This literature appears in history in the 4th or 5th century BC. Probably this literature was put together in Babylon. We have already told how the pharaoh, Necho II, invaded the Assyrian Empire while Assyria was fighting for life against Medes, Persians, Chaldeans. Josiah, king of Judea, opposed him and was defeated and slain at Megiddo, 608 BC. And when Nebuchadnezzar the Great, the new Chaldean king in Babylon, rolled back Necho into Egypt, he attempted to manage Judah by setting up puppet kings in Jerusalem. The experiment failed. The people massacred his Babylonian officials, and then he determined to break up this little state altogether, which had long been playing off Egypt against the Northern Empire. Jerusalem was sacked and burned, and the remnant of the people was carried off captive to Babylon. There they remained until Cyrus took Babylon, 538 BC. He then collected them together and sent them back to resettle their country and rebuild the walls and temple of Jerusalem. Before that time, the Jews did not seem to have been a very civilized or united people. Probably only a very few of them could read and write. In their own history, one never hears of the early books of the Bible being read. The first mention of a book is in the time of Josiah. The Babylonian captivity civilized them and consolidated them. They returned aware of their own literature and acutely self-conscious and political people. Their Bible at that time seems to have consisted only of the Pentateuch, that is to say, the 5 books of the Old Testament as we know it. In addition, as separate books, they already had many of the other books that have been incorporated with the Pentateuch into the present Hebrew Bible, Chronicles, the Psalms, and the Proverbs, for example. The accounts of the creation of the world, of Adam and Eve, and of the flood, with which the Bible begins, run closely parallel with similar Babylonian legends. They seem to have been part of the common beliefs of all the Semitic peoples. So too, the stories of Moses and of Samson have Sumerian and Babylonian parallels. But with the story of Abraham and onward begins something more special to the Jewish race. Abraham may have lived as early as the days of Hammurabi in Babylon. He was a patriarchal Semitic nomad. To the book of Genesis, the reader must go for the story of his wanderings and for the stories of his sons and grandchildren and how they became captive in the land of Egypt. He traveled through Canaan, and the God of Abraham, says the Bible story, promised this smiling land of prosperous cities to him and to his grandchildren. After a long sojourn in Egypt and after 50 years of wandering in the wilderness under the leadership of Moses, the children of Abraham, grown now to a house of 12 tribes, invaded the land of Canaan from the Arabian deserts to the east. They may have done this somewhen between 1600 BC and 1300 BC. There are no Egyptian records of Moses nor of Canaan at this time to help out the story. But at any rate, they did not succeed in conquering any more than the hilly backgrounds of the Promised Land. The coast was now in the hands not of the Canaanites, but of newcomers, those Asian peoples, the Philistines, and their cities, Gaza, Gath, Ashdod, Ascalon, and Joppa, successfully withstood the Hebrew attack. For many generations, the children of Abraham remained an obscure people of the hilly back country, engaged in incessant bickerings with the Philistines and with the kindred tribes about them, the Moabites, the Midianites, and so forth. The reader will find in the book of Judges a record of the struggles and disasters during this period. For very largely, it is a record of disasters and failures frankly told. In the picture you can see the land of the Hebrews, with Egypt on the Sinai Peninsula and the Arabian deserts on its right, and the Arabian deserts on its right. For most of this period, the Hebrews were ruled, so far as there was any rule among them, by priestly judges selected by the elders of the people. But at last, somewhen towards 1000 BC, they chose themselves a king, Saul, to lead them in battle. But Saul's leading was no great improvement upon the leading of the judges. He perished under the hail of Philistine arrows at the battle of Mount Gilboa. His armor went into the temple of the Philistine Venus, and his body was nailed to the walls of Bethshan. In the picture you can see the mount at Babylon, beneath which are the great remains of a great palace of Nebuchadnezzar. Photo by Underwood and Underwood. His successor David was more successful and more politic. With David dawned the only period of prosperity the Hebrew peoples were ever to know. It was based on a close allegiance with the Phoenician city of Tyre, whose king Hiram seems to have been a man of very great intelligence and enterprise. He wished to secure a trade route to the Red Sea through the Hebrew Hill country. Normally, Phoenician trade went into the Red Sea by Egypt. But Egypt was in a state of profound disorder at this time. There may have been other obstructions to Phoenician trade along this line, and at any rate, Hiram established the very closest relations both with David and with his son and successor Solomon. Under Hiram's auspices, the walls, palace, and temple of Jerusalem arose, and in return, Hiram built and launched his ships on the Red Sea. A very considerable trade passed northward and southward through Jerusalem, and Solomon achieved a prosperity and magnificence unprecedented in the experience of his people. He was even given a daughter of Pharaoh in marriage. But it is well to keep the proportion of things in mind. At the climax of his glories, Solomon was only a little subordinate king in a little city. His power was so transitory that within a few years of his death, Shishak, the first pharaoh of the 22nd dynasty, had taken Jerusalem and looted most of its splendors. The account of Solomon's magnificence given in the books of Kings and Chronicles is questioned by many critics. They say that it was added to and exaggerated by the patriotic pride of later writers. But the Bible account, read carefully, is not so overwhelming as it appears at the first reading. Solomon's temple, if one works out the measurements, would go inside a small suburban church. And his 1,400 chariots cease to impress us when we learn from an Assyrian monument that his successor Ahab sent a contingent of 2,000 to the Assyrian army. It is also plainly manifest from the Bible narrative that Solomon spent himself in display and overtaxed and overworked his people. At his death, the northern part of his kingdom broke off from Jerusalem and became the independent kingdom of Israel. Jerusalem remained the capital city of Judah. In the picture you can see the Ishtar gateway in Babylon. The bulls are in richly colored enamel on baked brick. Photo by Underwood and Underwood. The prosperity of the Hebrew people was short-lived. Hiram died, and the help of Tyre ceased to strengthen Jerusalem. Egypt grew strong again. The history of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah becomes a history of two little states, ground between first Syria, then Assyria, and then Babylon to the north and Egypt to the south. It is a tale of disasters and of deliverances that only delay disaster. It is a tale of barbaric kings ruling a barbaric people. In 721 BC, the kingdom of Israel was swept away into captivity by the Assyrians, and its people utterly lost to history. Judah struggled on until 604 BC. As we have told, it shared the fate of Israel. There may be details open to criticism in the Bible story of Hebrew history from the days of the judges onward, but on the whole, it is evidently a true story which squares with all that has been learned in the excavation of Egypt and Assyria and Babylon during the past century. It was in Babylon that the Hebrew people got their history together and evolved their tradition. The people who came back to Jerusalem at the command of Cyrus were a very different people in spirit and knowledge from those who had gone into captivity. They had learned civilization in the development of their peculiar character. A very great part was played by certain men, a new sort of men, the prophets, to whom we must direct our attention. These prophets mark the appearance of new and remarkable forces in the steady development of human society. End of chapter. Chapter number 22. Priests and prophets in Judea. The fall of Assyria and Babylon were only the first of a series of disasters that were to happen to the Semitic peoples. In the 7th century BC, it would have seemed as though the whole civilized world was to be dominated by Semitic rulers. They ruled the great Assyrian Empire and they had conquered Egypt. Assyria, Babylon, Syria were all Semitic, speaking languages that were mutually intelligible. The trade of the world was in Semitic hands. Tyre, Sidon, the great mother cities of the Phoenician coast, had thrown out colonies that grew at last to greater proportion in Spain, Sicily, and Africa. Carthage, found before 800 BC, had risen to a population of more than 1 million. It was for a time the greatest city on earth. Its ships went to Britain and out into the Atlantic. They may have reached Madeira. We have already noted how Hiram cooperated with Solomon to build ships on the Red Sea for the Arabian and perhaps for the Indian trade. In the time of the pharaoh Necho, a Phoenician expedition sailed completely round Africa. At that time, the Aryan peoples were still barbarians. Only the Greeks were reconstructing a new civilization of the ruins of the one they had destroyed, and the Medes were becoming formidable. as an Assyrian inscription calls them, in Central Asia. In 800 BC, no one could have prophesied that before the 3rd century BC, every trace of Semitic dominion would be wiped out by Aryan-speaking conquerors, and that everywhere the Semitic peoples would be subjects or tributaries or scattered together. Everywhere except in the northern deserts of Arabia, where the Bedouin adhere steadily to the nomadic way of life, the ancient way of life of the Semites before Sargon I, and his Akkadians went down to conquer Sumeria, but the Arab Bedouin were never conquered by Aryan masters. Now, of all the civilized Semites who were beaten and overrun in these 5 eventful centuries, one people only held together and clung to its ancient traditions, and that was this little people, the Jews, who were sent back to build their city of Jerusalem by Cyrus the Persian. And they were able to do this because they had together this literature of theirs, their Bible, in Babylon. It is not so much the Jews who made the Bible as the Bible which made the Jews. It is not so much the Jews who made the Bible as the Bible which made the Jews. Running through this Bible were certain ideas, different from the ideas of the people about them, very stimulating and sustaining ideas, to which they were destined to cling through 5 and 20 centuries of hardship, adventure, and oppression. Foremost of these Jewish ideas was this, that their God was invisible and remote. An invisible God in a temple not made with hands, a Lord of righteousness throughout the earth. All other peoples had national gods, embodied in images that live in temples. If the image was smashed and the temple razed, presently that God died out. But this was a new idea. This God of the Jews in the heavens, high above priests and sacrifices, and this God of Abraham, the Jews believe, had chosen them to be his peculiar people, to restore Jerusalem and make it the capital of righteousness in the world. They were a people exalted by their sense of common destiny. This belief saturated them all when they returned to Jerusalem after their captivity in Babylon. Is it any miracle that their days of overthrow and subjugation, many Babylonians and Syrians and so forth, and later on many Phoenicians, speaking practically the same language and having endless costumes, habits, tastes, and traditions in common, should be attacked by this inspiring cult and should seek to share in its fellowship and its promise? After the fall of Tyre, Sidon, Carthage, and the Spanish Phoenician cities, the Phoenicians suddenly vanished from history. And as suddenly we find, not simply in Jerusalem, but in Spain, Africa, Egypt, Arabia, the East, wherever the Phoenicians had set their feet, communities of Jews. And they were all held together by the Bible and by the reading of the Bible. Jerusalem was, from the first, only their nominal capital. The real city was this book of books. This is a new sort of thing in history. It is something of which the seeds were sown long before, when the Sumerians and the Egyptians began to turn their hieroglyphics into writing. The Jews were a new thing, a people without a king, and presently without a temple. For as we shall tell, Jerusalem itself was broken up in 70 AD, held together and consolidated out of heterogeneous elements by nothing but the power of the written word. And this mental wielding of the Jews was neither planned, nor foreseen, nor done by either priests or statesmen. Not only a new kind of community, But a new kind of man comes into history with the development of the Jews. In the days of Solomon, the Hebrews looked like becoming a little people, just like any other little people of that time, clustering around court and temple, ruled by the wisdom of the priests and led by the ambition of the king. But already the reader may learn from the Bible, this new sort of man of which we speak, the prophet, was in evidence. As troubles thicken round the divided Hebrews, the importance of these prophets increases. In the picture, you can see the black obelisk of Shalmaneser II. This obelisk, in the British Museum of the King of Assyria, mentions in cuneiform Jehu, the son of Omri, panels showing Jewish captives bringing tribute. What were these prophets? They were men of the most diverse origins. The prophet Ezekiel was of the priestly caste, and the prophet Amos wore the goatskin mantle of a shepherd. But all had this in common, that they gave allegiance to no one but the God of righteousness, and that they spoke directly to the people. They came without license or consecration. Now, the word of the Lord came unto me. That was the formula. They were intensely political. They exhorted the people against Egypt, that broken reed, or against Assyria or Babylon. They denounced the indolence of the priestly order or the flagrant sins of the king. Some of them turned their attention to what we should now call social reform. The rich were grinding the faces of the poor. The luxurious were consuming the children's bread. Wealthy people made friends with and imitated the splendors and vices of foreigners. And this was hateful to Jehovah, the God of Abraham, who would certainly punish this land. In the picture you can see another panel of the black obelisk. Captive princes making obeisance to Shalmaneser II. These fulminations were written down and preserved and studied. They went wherever the Jews went, and wherever they went, they spread a new religious spirit. They carried the common man past priest and temple, past court and king, and brought him face to face with the rule of righteousness. That is their supreme importance in the history of mankind. In the great utterances of Isaiah, the prophetic voice rises to a pitch of splendid anticipation and foreshadows the whole earth united and at peace under one God. Therein, the Jewish prophecies culminate. All the prophets did not speak in this fashion, and the intelligent reader of the prophetic books will find much hate in them, much prejudice, and much that will remind him of the propaganda pamphlets of the present time. Nevertheless, it is the Hebrew prophets of the period round and about the Babylon captivity who mark the appearance of a new power in the world. The power of individual moral appeal, of an appeal to the free conscience of mankind against the fetish sacrifices and slavish royalties that had hitherto bridled and harnessed our race. End of chapter. End of chapter.
Chapter number 23, The Greeks. Now, while after Solomon, whose reign was probably about 960 BC, The divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah were suffering destruction and deportation, and while the Jewish people were developing their tradition in captivity in Babylon, another great power of the human mind, the Greek tradition, was also arising. While the Hebrew prophets were working out a new sense of direct moral responsibility between the people and an eternal and universal God of right, the Greek philosophers were training the human mind in a new method and spirit of intellectual adventure. The Greek tribes, as we have told, were a branch of the Aryan-speaking system. They had come down among the Aegean cities and islands some centuries before 1000 BC. They were probably already in southward movement before the pharaoh Thutmose hunted his first elephants beyond the conquered Euphrates, for in those days there were elephants in Mesopotamia and lions in Greece. It is possible that it was a Greek raid that burnt Knossos, but there are no Greek legends of such a victory, though there are stories of Minos and his palace, the labyrinth, and of the skill of the Cretan artificers. In the picture you can see statue of Meleager. Note the progress in plastic power from the earlier wooden statue on left. Photo by Seba and Folier. Like most of the Aryans, these Greeks had singers and reciters whose performances were an important social link, and these handed down from the barbaric beginnings of the people two great epics, the Iliad, telling how a league of Greek tribes besieged and took and sacked the town of Troy in Asia Minor, and the Odyssey, being a long adventure story of the return of the sage captain Odysseus from Troy to his own island. These epics were written down somewhere in the 8th or 7th century BC, when the Greeks had acquired the use of an alphabet from their more civilized neighbors, but they are supposed to have been in existence very much earlier. Formerly, they were ascribed to a particular blind bard, Homer, who was supposed to have sat down and composed them as Milton composed Paradise Lost. Whether there really was such a poet, whether he composed or only wrote down and polished these epics and so forth, is a favorite quarreling ground for the erudite. We need not concern ourselves with such bickerings here. The thing that matters from our point of view is that the Greeks were in possession of their epics in the 8th century BC, and that they were a common possession and a link between their various tribes, giving them a sense of fellowship as against the outer barbarians. They were a group of kindred peoples linked by the spoken and afterwards by the written word, and sharing common ideals of courage and behavior. The epics showed the Greeks a barbaric people without iron, without writing, and still not living in cities. They seem to have lived at first in open villages of huts around the halls of their chiefs outside the ruins of the Aegean cities they had destroyed. Then they began to wall these cities and to adopt the idea of temples from the people they had conquered. It has been said that the cities of the primitive civilizations grew up about the altar of some tribal god, and that the wall was added. In the cities of the Greeks, the wall preceded the temple. They began to trade and send out colonies. By the 7th century BC, a new series of cities had grown up in the valleys and islands of Greece, forgetful of the Aegean cities and civilizations that had preceded them: Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, Samos, Miletus among the chief. There were already Greek settlements along the coast of the Black Sea and in Italy and in Sicily. The heel and toe of Italy was called Magna Graecia. Marseille was a Greek town established on the site of an earlier Phoenician colony. Now countries which are great plains or which have as a chief means of transport some great river like the Euphrates or Nile tend to become united under some common rule. The cities of Egypt and the cities of Sumeria, for example, ran together under one system government. But the Greek peoples were cut among islands and mountain valleys. Both Greece and Magna Graecia are very mountainous, and the tendency was all the other way. When the Greeks come into history, they are divided up into a number of little states which showed no signs of coalescence. They are differently even in race. Some consist chiefly of citizens of this or that Greek tribe, Ionic, Aeolian, or Doric. Some have a mingled population of Greeks and descendants of the pre-Greek Mediterranean folk. Some have an unmixed free citizenship of Greeks, lording it over an enslaved, conquered population, like the Helots in Sparta. In some, the old leaderly Aryan families have become a close aristocracy. In some, there is a democracy of all the Aryan citizens. In some, there are elected or even hereditary kings. In some, usurpers or tyrants. In the picture, you can see ruins of the great temple of Zeus at Olympia. Photo by Fred Boissonas. And the same geographical conditions that kept the Greek states divided and various kept them small. The largest states were smaller than many English counties, and it is doubtful if the population of any of these cities ever exceeded 1/3 Few came up even to 50,000. There were unions of interest and sympathy, but no coalescence. Cities made leagues and alliances as trade increased, and small cities put themselves under the protection of great ones. Yet all Greece was held together in a certain community of feeling by two things, by the epics and by the custom of taking part every 4th year in the athletic contests at Olympia. This did not prevent wars and feuds, but it mitigated something of the savagery of war between them, and a truce protected all travelers to and fro from the games. As time went on, the sentiment of a common heritage grew, and the number of states participating in the Olympic Games increased, until at last not only Greeks, but competitors from the closely kindred countries of Epirus and Macedonia to the north were admitted. The Greek cities grew in trade and importance, and the quality of their civilization rose steadily in the 7th and 6th centuries BC. Their social life differed in many interesting points from the social life of the Aegean and river valley civilizations. They had splendid temples, but the priesthood was not the great traditional body it was in the cities of the older world, the repository of all knowledge, the storehouse of ideas. They had leaders and noble families, but no quasi-divine monarch surrounded by an elaborately organized court. Rather, their organization was aristocratic, with leading families which kept each other in order. Even their so-called democracies were aristocratic. Every citizen had a share in public affairs and came to the assembly in a democracy. But everybody was not a citizen. The Greek democracies were not like our modern democracies, in which everyone has a vote. Many of the Greek democracies had a few hundred or a few thousand citizens, and then many thousands of slaves. Freedmen and so forth were no share in public affairs. Generally in Greece, affairs were in the hands of a community of substantial men. Their kings and their tyrants alike were just men set in front of other men or usurping a leadership. They were not quasi-divine overmen like Pharaoh or Minos or the monarchs of Mesopotamia. Both thought and government, therefore, had a freedom under Greek conditions, such as they had known in none of the older civilizations. The Greeks had brought down into cities the individualism, the personal initiative of the wandering life of the northern parklands. They were the first republicans of importance in history. In the picture you can see the temple of Neptune, Poseidon, Paestum, Sicily, photo by Alinari. And we find that as they emerge from a condition of barbaric warfare, a new thing becomes apparent in their intellectual life. We find men who are not priests seeking and recording knowledge and acquiring into the mysteries of life and being in a way that has hitherto been the sublime privilege of priesthood or the presumptuous amusement of kings. We find already in the 6th century BC, perhaps while Isaiah was still prophesying in Babylon, such men as Thales and Anaximander of Miletus and Heraclitus of Ephesus, who were what we should now call independent gentlemen, giving their minds to shrewd questionings of the world in which we live, asking what real nature was, whence it came, and what its destiny might be, and refusing all ready-made or evasive answers. Of these questionings of the universe by the Greek mind, we shall have more to say a little later in this history. These Greek inquirers, who begin to be remarkable in the 6th century BC, are the first philosophers, the first wisdom lovers in the world. And it may be noted here how important a century this 6th century BC was in the history of humanity. For not only were these Greek philosophers beginning the research for clear ideas about the universe and man's place in it, and Isaiah carrying Jewish prophecy to its sublimest levels, but as we shall tell later, Gautama Buddha was then teaching in India and Confucius and Lao Tse in China. From Athens to the Pacific, the human mind was astir. Chapter 24. The Wars of the Greeks and Persians. While the Greeks in the cities in Greece, South Italy, and Asia Minor were embarking upon free intellectual inquiry, and while in Babylon and Jerusalem the last of the Hebrew prophets were creating a free conscience for mankind, two adventurous Aryan peoples, the Medes and the Persians, were in the possession of the civilization of the ancient world and were making a great empire, the Persian Empire, which was far larger in extent than any empire the world had seen hitherto. Under Cyrus, Babylon and the rich and ancient civilization of Lydia had been added to the Persian rule. The Phoenician cities of the Levant and all the Greek cities in Asia Minor had been made tributary. Cambyses had subjected Egypt, and Darius I, the Mede, the third of the Persian rulers from 521 BC, found himself monarch, as it seemed, of the world. His couriers rode with his decrees from the Dardanelles to the Indus and from Upper Egypt to Central Asia. The Greeks in Europe, it is true, Italy, Carthage, Sicily, and the Spanish Phoenician settlements were not under the Persian peace, but they treated it with respect, and the only people who gave any serious trouble were the old parent hordes of Nordic people in South Russia and Central Asia, the Scythians, who raided the northern and northeastern borders. Of course, the population of this great Persian empire was not a population of Persians. The Persians were only the small conquering minority of this enormous realm. The rest of the population was what it had been before the Persians came from time immemorial. Only the Persian was the administrative language. Trade and finance were still largely Semitic. Tyre and Sidon, as of old, were the great Mediterranean ports, and Semitic shipping plied upon the seas. But many of these Semitic merchants and business people, as they went from place to place, already found a sympathetic and convenient common history in the Hebrew tradition and the Hebrew scriptures. A new element which was increasing rapidly in this empire was the Greek element. The Greeks were becoming serious rivals to the Semites upon the sea, and their detached and vigorous intelligence made them useful and unprejudiced officials. In the picture, you can see a fine piece of Athenian pottery showing Greek merchant vessels with sails and oars statue on left. Brit Mus. It was on account of the Scythians that Darius I invaded Europe. He wanted to reach South Russia, the homeland of the Scythian horsemen. He crossed the Bosphorus with a great army and marched through Bulgaria to the Danube, crossed this by a bridge of boats and pushed far northward. His army suffered terribly. It was largely an infantry force, and the mounted Scythians rode all round it, cut off its supplies, destroyed any stragglers, and never came to a pitched battle. Darius was forced into an inglorious retreat. He returned himself to Susa, but he left an army in Thrace and Macedonia submitted to Darius. Insurrections of the Greek cities in Asia followed this failure, and the European Greeks were drawn into the contest. Darius resolved upon the subjugation of the Greeks in Europe. With a Phoenician fleet at his disposal, he was able to subdue one island after another, and finally, in 490 BC, he made his main attack upon Athens. A considerable armada sailed from the ports of Asia Minor and the eastern Mediterranean, and the expedition landed its troops at Marathon to the north of Athens. There they were met and signally defeated by the Athenians. An extraordinary thing happened at this time. The bitterest rival of Athens in Greece was Sparta, but now Athens appealed to Sparta, sending a herald, a swift runner, imploring the Spartans not to let Greeks become slaves to barbarians. This runner, the prototype of all marathon runners, did over 100 miles of broken country in less than 2 days. The Spartans responded promptly and generously, but when, in 3 days, the Spartan force reached Athens, there was nothing for it to do but to view the battlefield and the bodies of the defeated Persian soldiers. The Persian fleet had returned to Asia. So ended the first Persian attack on Greece. The next was much more impressive. Darius died soon after the news of his defeat at Marathon reached him, and for 4 years his son and successor Xerxes prepared a host to crush the Greeks. For a time, terror united all the Greeks. The army of Xerxes was certainly the greatest that had hitherto been assembled in the world. It was a huge assembly of discordant elements. It crossed the Dardanelles, 480 BC, by a bridge of boats, and along the coast, as it advanced, moved an equally miscellaneous fleet carrying supplies. At the narrow pass of Thermopylae, a small force of 14,000 men under the Spartan Leonidas resisted this multitude, and after a fight of unsurpassed heroism was completely destroyed. Every man was killed, but the losses they inflicted upon the Persians were enormous, and the army of Xerxes pushed on to Thebes and Athens in a chastened mood. Thebes surrendered and made terms. The Athenians abandoned their city and it was burnt. Greece seemed in the hands of a conqueror, but again came victory against the odds and all expectations. The Greek fleet, though not a third the size of the Persian, assailed it in the Bay of Salamis and destroyed it. Xerxes found himself and his immense army cut off from supplies, and his heart failed him. He retreated to Asia with one of his army, leaving the rest to be defeated at Plataea, 479 BC. What time the remnants of the Persian fleet were hunted down by the Greeks and destroyed at Mycelia in Asia Minor. In this picture you can see all that remains of the great Temple of Corinth. The photo by Fred Boissonas. The Persian danger was at an end. Most of the Greek cities in Asia became free. All this is told in great detail and with much picturesqueness in the first of written histories, the history of Herodotus. This Herodotus was born about 484 BC in the Ionian city of Halicarnassus in Asia Minor, and he visited Babylon and Egypt in his search for exact particulars. From Mycenae onward, Persia sank into a confusion of dynastic troubles. Xerxes was murdered in 465 BC, and rebellions in Egypt, Syria, and Media broke up the brief order of that mighty realm. The history of Herodotus lays stress on the weakness of Persia. This history is indeed what we should now call propaganda. Propaganda for Greece to unite and conquer Persia. Herodotus makes one character, Aristogoras, go to the Spartans with a map of the known world and say to them, "These barbarians are not valiant in fight. You, on the other hand, have now attained the utmost skill in war. No other nations in the world have what they possess: gold, silver, bronze, embroidered garments, beasts, and slaves. All this you might have for yourselves, if you so desired." In the picture you can see the Temple of Neptune, Poseidon, at Cape Sunium. Photo, Fred Boysonas. Chapter 25. The Splendor of Greece. The century and a half that followed the defeat of Persia was one of very great splendor for the Greek civilization. True that Greece was torn by a desperate struggle for ascendancy between Athens, Sparta, and other states, the Peloponnesian War, 431 to 404 BC, and that in 338 BC, the Macedonians became virtually masters of Greece. Nevertheless, during this period, the thought and the creative and artistic impulse of the Greeks rose to levels that made their achievement a lamp to mankind for all the rest of history. The head and center of this mental activity was Athens. For over 30 years, 466 to 428 BC, Athens was dominated by a man of great vigor and liberty of mind, Pericles, who set himself to rebuild the city from the ashes to which the Persians had reduced it. The beautiful ruins that still glorify Athens today are chiefly the remains of this great effort. And he did not simply rebuild a material Athens, he rebuilt Athens intellectually. He gathered about him not only architects and sculptors, but poets, dramaticists, philosophers, and teachers. Herodotus came to Athens to recite his history, 438 BC. Anaxagoras came with the beginnings of a scientific description of the sun and stars. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, one after the other, carried the Greek drama to its highest levels of beauty and nobility. The impetus Pericles gave to the intellectual life of Athens lived on after his death, and in spite of the fact that the peace of Greece was now broken by the Peloponnesian War and a long and wasteful struggle for ascendancy was beginning, indeed the darkening of the political horizon seems for a time to have quickened rather than discouraged men's minds. Already long before the time of Pericles, the peculiar freedom of Greek institutions had given great importance to the skill in discussion. Decision rested neither with king nor with priest, but in the assemblies of the people or of leading men. Eloquence and able argument became very desirable accomplishments, therefore, and a class of teachers arose, the sophists, who undertook to strengthen young men in these arts. But one cannot reason without matter, and knowledge followed in the wake of speech. The activities and rivalries of these sophists led very naturally to an acute examination of style, of methods of thought, and of the validity of arguments. When Pericles died, a certain Socrates was becoming prominent as an able and destructive critic of bad argument, and much of the teaching of the sophists was bad argument. A group of brilliant young men gathered about Socrates. In the end, Socrates was executed for disturbing people's minds in 399 BC. He was condemned after the dignified fashion of the Athens of those days to drink in his own house and among his own friends a poisonous draught made from hemlock. But the disturbance of people's minds went on in spite of his condemnation. His young men carried on his teaching.
In the picture you can see part of the famous frieze of the Parthenon in Athens, a specimen of Grecian sculpture in its finest expression. Compare the advance of art with that seen in And the Animals, shown on page 105. Photo by Fred Boissonas. In this picture you can see the Acropolis in Athens, the marvelous group of temples and monuments built under the inspiration of Pericles. Photo by Fred Boissonas as well. And in this picture you can see the theater at Epidauros in Greece. Wonderfully preserved specimen showing the vast auditorium. Photo by Fred Boissonas.
Chief among these young men was Plato, 427 to 347 BC, who presently began to teach philosophy in the grove of the academy. His teaching fell into two main divisions: an examination of the foundations and methods of human thinking, and an examination of political institutions. He was the first man to write a utopia, that is to say, the plan of a community different from and better than any existing community. This shows an altogether unprecedented boldness in the human mind, which had hitherto accepted social traditions and usages with scarcely a question. Plato said plainly to mankind, "Most of the social and political ills from which you suffer are under your control, given only the will and courage to change them. You can live in another and a wiser fashion if you choose to think it out and work it out. You are not awake to your own power. That is a high, adventurous teaching that has still to soak into the common intelligence of our race." One of his earliest works was The Republic, a dream of a communist aristocracy. His last unfinished work was The Laws, a scheme of regulation for another such utopian state.
In this photo you can see the Caryatides of the Erechtheum, the ancient sanctuary of the Acropolis at Athens. Photo by Fred Boissonas. And in this picture you can see Athene of the Parthenon. Photo by Ali Nart.
The criticism of methods of thinking and methods of government was carried on after Plato's death by Aristotle, who had been his pupil and who taught in the Lyceum. Aristotle came from the city of Stagira in Macedonia, and his father was court physician to the Macedonian king. For a time, Aristotle was tutor to Alexander, the king's son, who was destined to achieve very great things, of which we shall soon be telling. Aristotle's work upon methods of thinking carried the science of logic to a level at which it remained for 1500 years or more, until the medieval schoolmen took up the ancient questions again. He made no utopias. Before man could really control his destiny as Plato taught, Aristotle perceived that he needed far more knowledge and far more accurate knowledge than he possessed. And so Aristotle began that systematic collection of knowledge which we nowadays call science. His students at the Lyceum examined and compared the constitutions of 158 different states. Here in the 4th century BC, we find men who are practically modern thinkers. The childlike, dreamlike methods of primitive thought had given way to a disciplined and critical attack upon the problems of life. The weird and monstrous symbolism and imagery of the gods and god monsters, and all the taboos and awes and restraints that have hitherto encumbered thinking are here completely set aside. Free, exact and systematic thinking has begun. The fresh and unencumbered mind of these newcomers out of the northern forests has thrust itself into the mysteries of the temple and let the daylight in.
End of chapter.
Chapter 26. The Empire of Alexander the Great. From 431 to 404 BC, the Peloponnesian War wasted Greece. Meanwhile, to the north of Greece, the kindred country of Macedonia was rising slowly to power and civilization. The Macedonians spoke a language closely akin to Greek, and on several occasions Macedonian competitors had taken part in the Olympic Games. In 359 BC, a man of very great abilities and ambition became king of this little country, Philip. Philip had previously been a hostage in Greece. He had had a thoroughly Greek education, and he was probably aware of the ideas of Herodotus, which had also been developed by the philosopher Isocrates, of a possible conquest of Asia by consolidated Greece. He set himself first to extend and organize his own realm and to remodel his army. For 1,000 years now, the charging horse chariot had been the decisive factor in battles. That and the close fighting infantry. Mounted horsemen had also fought, but as a cloud of skirmishers, individually and without discipline. Philip made his infantry fight in a close packed mass, the Macedonian phalanx, and he trained his mounted gentlemen, the knights or companions, to fight in formation, and so invented cavalry. The master move in most of his battles, and in the battles of his son Alexander, was a cavalry charge. The phalanx held the enemy infantry in front, while the cavalry swept away the enemy horse on his wings and poured in on the flank and rear of his infantry. Chariots were disabled by bowmen who shot the horses. With this new army, Philip extended his frontiers through Thessaly to Greece, and the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BC fought against Athens and the allies, put all Greece at his feet. At last the dream of Herodotus was bearing fruit. A congress of all the Greek states appointed Philip captain general of the Greco-Macedonian Confederacy against Persia, and in 336 BC his advanced guard crossed into Asia upon this long premeditated adventure. But he never followed it. He was assassinated, it is believed, at the instigation of his queen Olympias, Alexander's mother. She was jealous because Philip had married a second wife.
In this picture you can see the bust of Alexander the Great, as in the British Museum.
But Philip had taken unusual pains with his son's education. He had not only secured Aristotle, the greatest philosopher in the world, as this boy's tutor, but he had shared his ideas with him and thrust military experience upon him. At Chaeronea, Alexander, who was then only 18 years old, had been in command of the cavalry, and so it was possible for this young man, who was still only 20 years old at the time of his accession, to take up his father's task, at once and to proceed successfully with the Persian adventure. In 334 BC, for 2 years were needed to establish and confirm his position in Macedonia and Greece. He crossed into Asia, defeated a not very much bigger Persian army at the Battle of the Granicus, and captured a number of cities in Asia Minor. He kept along the seacoast. It was necessary for him to reduce and garrison all the coast towns as he advanced, because the Persians had control of the fleets of Tyre and Sidon, and so had command of the sea. Had he left a hostile port in his rear, the Persians might have landed. Forces to raid his communications and cut him off. At Issus, 333 BC, he met and smashed a vast conglomerate host under Darius III. Like the host of Xerxes that had crossed the Dardanelles a century and a half before, it was an incoherent accumulation of contingents, and it was encumbered with a multitude of court officials, the harem of Darius, and many camp followers. Sidon surrendered to Alexander, but Tyre resisted obstinately. Finally, that great city was stormed and plundered and destroyed. Gaza also was stormed, and towards the end of 332 BC, the conqueror entered Egypt and took over its rule from the Persians.
In this picture you can see Alexander's victory over the Persians at Issus. From the Pompeian mosaic, Alexander charges in on the left. Darius is in the chariot to the right.
At Alexandretta and at Alexandria in Egypt, he built great cities, accessible from the land and so incapable of revolt. To these, the trade of the Phoenician cities were diverted. The Phoenicians of the Western Mediterranean suddenly disappear from history, and as immediately the Jews of Alexandria and the other new trading cities created by Alexander appear. In 331 BC, Alexander marched out of Egypt upon Babylon as Thutmose and Ramesses and Necho had done before him. But he marched by the way of Tyre. At Arbela, near the ruins of Nineveh, which was already a forgotten city, he met Darius and fought the decisive battle of the war. The Persian chariot charge failed. A Macedonian cavalry charge broke up the great composite host, and the phalanx completed the victory. Darius led the retreat. He made no further attempt to resist the invader, but fled northward into the country of the Medes. Alexander marched on to Babylon, still prosperous and important, and then to Susa and Persepolis. Thereafter, a drunken festival, he burned down the palace of Darius, the king of kings.
In this picture you can see the Apollo Belvedere.
Thence Alexander presently made a military parade of Central Asia, going to the utmost bounds of the Persian Empire. At first he turned northward. Darius was pursued, and he was overtaken at dawn, dying in his chariot, having been murdered by his own people. He was still living when the foremost Greeks reached him. Alexander came up to find him dead. Alexander skirted the Caspian Sea. He went up into the mountains of western Turkestan. He came down by Herat, which he founded, and Kabul and the Khyber Pass into India. He fought a great battle on the Indus with an Indian king, Porus, and here the Macedonian troops met elephants for the first time and defeated them. Finally, he built himself ships, sailed down the mouth of the Indus, and marched back by the coast of Baluchistan, reaching Susa again in 324 BC after an absence of 6 years. He then prepared to consolidate and organize this vast empire he had won. He sought to win over his new subjects. He assumed the robes and tiara of a Persian monarch, and this roused the jealousy of his Macedonian commanders. He had much trouble with them. He arranged a number of marriages between these Macedonian officers and Persian and Babylonian women. The marriage of the East and West. He never lived to effect the consolidation he had planned. A fever seized him after a drinking bout in Babylon, and he died in 323 BC. Immediately, this vast dominion fell to pieces. One of his generals, Seleucus, retained most of the old Persian Empire, from the Indus to Ephesus. Another, Ptolemy, seized Egypt, and Antigonus secured Macedonia. The rest of the empire remained unstable, passing under the control of a succession of local adventurers. Barbarian raids began from the north and grew in scope and intensity, until at last, as we shall tell, a new power, the power of the Roman Republic, came out of the west to subjugate one fragment after another and weld them together into a new and more enduring empire.
End of chapter. Chapter number 27. The Museum and Library at Alexandria. Before the time of Alexander, Greeks had already been spreading as merchants, artists, officials, mercenary soldiers over most of the Persian dominions. In the dynastic disputes that followed the death of Xerxes, a band of 10,000 Greek mercenaries played a part under the leadership of Xenophon. The return to Asiatic Greece from Babylon is described in his Retreat of the 10,000, one of the first war stories that was ever written by a general in command. But the conquests of Alexander and the division of his brief empire among his subordinate generals greatly stimulated this permeation of the ancient world by the Greeks and their language and fashions and culture. Traces of this Greek dissemination are to be found far away in Central Asia and in northwest India. Their influence upon the development of Indian art was profound. For many centuries, Athens retained their prestige as a center of art and culture. Her schools went on indeed to 529 AD, that is to say, for nearly 1,000 years. But the leadership in the intellectual activity of the world passed presently across the Mediterranean to Alexandria, the new trading city that Alexander had founded. Here, the Macedonian general Ptolemy had become pharaoh with a court that spoke Greek. He had become an intimate of Alexander before he became king, and he was deeply saturated with the ideas of Aristotle. He set himself with great energy and capacity to organize knowledge and investigation. He also wrote a history of Alexander's campaigns, which, unhappily, is lost to the world. Alexander had already devoted considerable sums to finance the inquiries of Aristotle, but Ptolemy I was the first person to make a permanent endowment of science. He set up a foundation in Alexandria, which was formerly dedicated to the Muses, the Museum of Alexandria. For 2 or 3 generations, the scientific work done at Alexandria was extraordinarily good. Euclid, Eratosthenes, who measured the size of the earth and came within 50 miles of its true diameter, Apollonius, who wrote on conic sections, Hipparchus, who made the first star map and catalog, and Hero or Hero, who devised the first steam engine, are among the greatest stars of an extraordinary constellation of scientific pioneers. Archimedes came from Syracuse to Alexandria to study. and was a frequent correspondent of the museum. Herophilus was one of the greatest of Greek anatomists, and is said to have practiced vivisection. For a generation or so during the reigns of Ptolemy I and Ptolemy II, there was such a blaze of knowledge and discovery at Alexandria as the world was not to see again until the 16th century AD. But it did not continue. There may have been several causes of this decline. Chiefly among them, the late Professor Mahaffy suggested, was the fact that the museum was a royal college, and all its professors and fellows were appointed and paid by Pharaoh. This was all very well when Pharaoh was Ptolemy I, the pupil and friend of Aristotle. But as the dynasty of the Ptolemies went on, they became Egyptianized and fell under the sway of Egyptian priests and Egyptian religious developments. They ceased to follow the work that was done, and their control stifled the spirit of inquiry altogether. The museum produced little good work after its first century of activity. Ptolemy I not only sought in the most modern spirit to organize the finding of fresh knowledge, he tried also to set up an encyclopedic storehouse of wisdom in the library of Alexandria. It was not simply a storehouse, it was also a book copying and book selling organization. A great army of copists was set to work perpetually multiplying copies of books. Here, then, we have the definite first opening up of the intellectual process in which we live today. Here we have the systematic gathering and distribution of knowledge. The foundation of this museum and library marks one of the great epochs in the history of mankind. It is the true beginning of modern history. In the picture you can see Aristotle from Herculaneum, probably 4th century BC. Photo by Dr. Singer. Both the work of research and the work of dissemination went on under serious handicaps. One of these was the great social gap that separated the philosopher, who was a gentleman, from the trader and the artisan. There were glass workers and metal workers in abundance in those days, but they were not in mental contact with the thinkers. The glass worker was making the most beautifully colored beads and fields and so forth, but he never made a Florentine flask or a lens. Clear glass does not seem to have interested him. The metal worker made weapons and jewelry, but he never made a chemical balance. The philosopher speculated loftily about atoms and the nature of things, but he had no practical experience of enamels and pigments and filters and so forth. He was not interested in substances. So, Alexandria, in its brief day of opportunity, produced no microscopes and no chemistry. And though Hero invented a steam engine, it was never set either to pump or drive a boat or do any useful thing. There were few practical applications of science except in the realm of medicine, and the process of science was not stimulated and sustained by the interest and excitement of practical application. There was nothing to keep the work going. Therefore, when the intellectual curiosity of Ptolemy I and Ptolemy II was withdrawn, the discoveries of the museum went on record in obscure manuscripts, and never, until the revival of scientific curiosity at the Renaissance, reached out to the mass of mankind. Nor did the library produce any improvements in bookmaking. That ancient world had no paper made in definite sizes, from rack pulp. Paper was a Chinese invention, and it did not reach the Western world until the 9th century AD. The only book materials where parchment and strips of the papyrus read, join edge to edge. These strips were kept on rolls, which were very unwieldy to wind to and fro and read, and very inconvenient for reference. It was these things that prevented the development of page and printed books. Printing itself was known in the world, it would seem, as clearly as the Old Stone Age. There were seals in ancient Sumeria, but without abundant paper, there was little advantage in printing books, an improvement that may further have been resisted by trades unionism on the part of copyists employed. Alexandria produced abundant books but not cheap books, and it never spread knowledge into the population of the ancient world below the level of a wealthy and influential class. In the picture you can see a statuette of Maitreya, the Buddha to come, a Greco-Buddhist sculpture of the 3rd century AD, from Malakand, NW province, now in the India Museum. So, it was this blaze of intellectual enterprise never reached beyond a small circle of people in touch with the group of philosophers collected by the first two Ptolemies. It was like the light in a dark lantern, which is shut off from the world at large. Within the blaze might be blinding bright, but nevertheless it is unseen. The rest of the world went on in subtle ways, unaware that the seed of scientific knowledge was one day to revolutionize it altogether had been sown. Presently, a darkness of bigotry fell upon Alexandria. Thereafter, for 1,000 years of darkness, the seed that Aristotle had sown lay hidden. Then it stirred and began to germinate. In a few centuries, it had become that widespread growth of knowledge and clear ideas that is now changing the whole of human life. In the picture you can see the death of Buddha, Greco-Buddhist carving from Sivat Valley, NW province, probably AD 305, in the India Museum. Alexandria was not the only center of Greek intellectual activity in the 3rd century BC. There were many other cities that display a brilliant intellectual life amidst the disintegrating fragments of the brief empire of Alexander. There was, for example, the Greek city of Syracuse in Sicily, where thought and science flourished for 2 centuries. There was Pergamon in Asia Minor, which also had a great library. But this brilliant Hellenic world was now stricken by invasion from the north. New Nordic barbarians, the Gauls, were striking down along the tracks that had once been followed by the ancestors of the Greeks and Phrygians and Macedonians. They raided, shattered, and destroyed, and in the wake of the Gauls came a new conquering people out of Italy, the Romans, who gradually subjugated all the western half of the vast realm of Darius and Alexander. They were an able but unimaginative people, preferring law and profit to either science or art. New invaders were also coming down out of Central Asia to shatter and subdue the Seleucid Empire, and to cut off the Western world again from India. These were the Parthians, hosts of mounted bowmen, who treated the Greco-Persian Empire of Persepolis and Susa in the 3rd century BC in much the same fashion that the Medes and Persians had treated it in the 7th and 6th. And there were now other nomadic peoples also coming out of the northeast, peoples who were not fair and Nordic and Aryan speaking, but yellow skin and black hair and with a Mongolian speech. But these latter people we shall tell more in a subsequent chapter. End of chapter.
Chapter 28. The Life of Gautama Buddha. But now we must go back 3 centuries in our story to tell of a great teacher who came near to revolutionizing the religious thought and feeling of all Asia. This was Gautama Buddha, who taught his disciples at Benares in India about the same time that Isaiah was prophesying among the Jews in Babylon, and Heraclitus was carrying on his speculative inquiries into the nature of things at Ephesus. All these men were in the world at the same time, in the 6th century BC, unaware of one another. This 6th century BC was indeed one of the most remarkable in all history. Everywhere, for as we shall tell, it was also this case in China. Men's minds were displaying a new boldness. Everywhere they were waking up out of the traditions of kingships and priests and blood sacrifices and asking the most penetrating questions. It is as if the race had reached a stage of adolescence after a childhood of 20,000 years. The early history of India is still very obscure. Somewhere perhaps about 2000 BC, an Aryan-speaking people came down from the northwest into India, either in one invasion or in a series of invasions, and was able to spread its language and traditions over most of North India. Its peculiar variety of Aryan speech was the Sanskrit. They found a brunette people with a more elaborate civilization and less vigor of will, in possession of the country of the Indus and Ganges. But they do not seem to have mingled with their predecessors as freely as did the Greeks and Persians. They remained aloof. When the past of India becomes dimly visible to the historian, Indian society is already stratified into several layers with a variable number of subdivisions, which do not eat together, nor intermarry, nor associate freely. And throughout history, this stratification into castes continues. This makes the Indian population something different from the simple, freely interbreeding European or Mongolian communities. It is really a community of communities. Siddhartha Gautama was the son of an aristocratic family which ruled a small district on the Himalayan slopes. He was married at 19 to a beautiful cousin. He hunted and played and went about in his sunny world of gardens and groves and irrigated rice fields. And it was amidst this life that a great discontent fell upon him. It was the unhappiness of a fine brain that seeks employment. He felt that the existence he was leading was not the reality of life, but a holiday that had gone on too long. The sense of disease and mortality, the insecurity and the unsatisfactoriness of all happiness descended upon the mind of Gautama. While he was in this mood, he met one of those wandering ascetics who already existed in great numbers in India. These men lived under severe rules, spending much time in meditation and in religious discussion. They were supposed to be seeking some deeper reality in life, and a passionate desire to do likewise took possession of God. He was meditating upon this project, says the story, when the news was brought to him that his wife had been delivered of his firstborn son. This is another tie to break, said Gautama. He returned to the village amidst the rejoicing of his fellow clansmen. There was a great feast and a Nautch dance to celebrate the birth of his new tie. And in the night Gautama awoke in a great agony of spirit, like a man who is told that his house is on fire. He resolved to leave his happy, aimless life forthwith. He went softly to the threshold of his wife's chamber and saw her by the light of a little oil lamp, sleeping sweetly, surrounded by flowers, with his infant son in her arms. He felt a great craving to take up the child in one fist and last embrace before he departed. but the fear of waking his wife prevented him, and at last he turned away and went out into the bright Indian moonshine and mounted his horse and rode off into the world.
In the picture you can see a Tibetan Buddha, gilt brass casting in India Museum, showing Gautama Buddha in the Earth Witness attitude, India Museum.
Very far he rode that night, and in the morning he stopped outside the lands of his clan and dismounted beside a sandy river. There he cut off his flowing locks with his sword, removed all his ornaments, and sent them and his horse and his sword back to his house. Going on, he presently met a ragged man and exchanged clothes with him. And so, having divested himself of all worldly entanglements, he was free to pursue his search after wisdom. He made his way southward to a resort of hermits and teachers in a hilly spur of the Vindhya mountains. There lived a number of wise men in a warren of caves, going into the town for their simple supplies and imparting their knowledge by word of mouth to such as cared to came to them. Gautama became versed in all the metaphysics of his age, but his acute intelligence was dissatisfied with the solutions offered him.
A Burmese Buddha, marble figure from Mandalay, 18th century work, now in the India Museum.
The Indian mind has always been disposed to believe that power and knowledge may be obtained by extreme asceticism, by fasting, sleeplessness, and self-torment. And these ideas Gautama now put to the test. He betook himself with 5 disciple companions to the jungle, and there he gave himself up to the fasting and terrible penances. His fame spread, like the sound of a great bell hung in the canopy of the skies. But it brought him no sense of truth achieved. One day he was walking up and down, trying to think in spite of his enfeebled state. Suddenly he fell unconscious. When he recovered, the preposterousness of these semi-magical ways to wisdom was plain to him. The preposterousness of these semi-magical ways to wisdom was plain to him.
In the picture you can see the Mech Tower in the Deer Park at Sarnath, 6th century AD, from a painting in the India Museum.
He horrified his companions by demanding ordinary food and refusing to continue his mortifications. He had realized that whatever truth a man may reach is reached best by a nourished brain in a healthy body. Such a conception was absolutely foreign to the ideas of the land and age. His disciples deserted him and went off in a melancholy state to Benares. Gautama wandered alone. When the mind grapples with a great and intricate problem, it makes its advances step by step, with but little realization of the gains it has made, until suddenly, with an effect of abrupt illumination, it realizes its victory. So it happened to Gautama. He had seated himself under a great tree by the side of a river to eat. When the sense of clear vision came to him, it seemed to him that he saw life plain. He said to have sat all day and all night in profound thought, and then he rose up to impart his vision to the world. He went on to Benares, and there he sought out and won back his lost disciples to his new teaching. In the King's Deer Park at Benares, they built themselves huts and set up a sort of school to which came many who were seeking after wisdom. The starting point of his teaching was his own question as a fortunate young man. Why am I not completely happy? It was an introspective question. It was a question very different in quality from the frank and self-forgetful, externalized curiosity with which Thales and Heraclitus were attacking the problems of the universe, or the equally self-forgetful burden of moral obligation that the culminating prophets were imposing upon the Hebrew mind. The Indian teacher did not forget self. He concentrated upon self and sought to destroy it. All suffering, he taught, was due to the greedy desires of the individual. Until man has conquered his personal cravings, his life is trouble and his end sorrow. There were three principal forms that the craving for life took, and they were all evil. The first was the desire of the appetites, greed, and all forms of sensuousness. The second was the desire for a personal and egotistic immortality. The third was the craving for personal success, worldliness, avarice, and the like. All these forms of desire had to be overcome to escape from the distresses and chagrins of life. When they were overcome, when self had vanished altogether, then serenity of soul, nirvana, the highest good, was attained. This was the gist of his teaching, a very subtle and metaphysical teaching indeed, not nearly so easy to understand as the Greek injunction to see and know fearlessly and rightly, and the Hebrew command to fear God and accomplish righteousness. It was a teaching much beyond the understanding of even Gautama's immediate disciples, and it is no wonder that so soon as his personal influence was withdrawn, it became corrupted and coarsened. There was a widespread belief in India at that time that at long intervals wisdom came to earth and was incarnate in some chosen person who was known as the Buddha. Gautama's disciples declared that he was a Buddha, the latest of the Buddhas, though there is no evidence that he himself ever accepted the title. Before he was well dead, a cycle of fantastic legends began to be woven about him. The human heart has always preferred a wonder story to a moral effort, and Gautama Buddha became very wonderful. Yet there remained a substantial gain in the world. If nirvana was too high and subtle for most men's imaginations, if the myth-making impulse in the race was too strong for the simple facts of Gautama's life, they could at least grasp something of the intention of what Gautama called the Eightfold Way, the Aryan or noble path in life. In this, there was an insistence upon mental uprightness, upon right aims and speech, right conduct, and honest livelihood. There was a quickening of the conscience and an appeal to generous and self-forgetful ends.
Chapter number 29. King Asoka. For some generations after the death of Gautama, these high and noble Buddhist teachings, this first plain teaching that the highest good for man is the subjugation of self, made comparatively little headway in the world. Then they conquered the imagination of one of the greatest monarchs the world has ever seen. We have already mentioned how Alexander the Great came down into India and fought with Horus upon the Indus. It is related by the Greek historians that a certain Chandragupta Maurya came into Alexander's camp and tried to persuade him to go on to the Ganges and conquer all India. Alexander could not do this because of the refusal of his Macedonians to go further into what was for them an unknown world. And later on, in the year 303 BC, Chandragupta was able to secure the help of various hill tribes and realize his dream without Greek help. He built up an empire in North India and was presently, in 303 BC, able to attack Seleucus first in the Punjab, drive his last vestige of Greek power out of India. His son extended his new empire. His grandson, Asoka, the monarch of whom we now have to tell found himself in 264 BC ruling from Afghanistan to Madras. Ashoka was at first disposed to follow the example of his father and grandfather and complete the conquest of the Indian peninsula. He invaded Kalinga in 255 BC, a country on the east coast of Madras. He was successful in his military operations and, alone among conquerors, he was so disgusted by the cruelty and horror of war that he renounced it. He would have no more of it. He adopted the peaceful doctrines of Buddhism and declared that henceforth his conquest should be the conquest of religions. In the picture you can see a Lohan or Buddhist apostle, Tang Dynasty, from the statue in the British Museum. His reign for 28 years was one of the brightest interludes in the troubled history of mankind. He organized a great digging of wells in India and the planting of trees for shade. He founded hospitals and public gardens and gardens for the growing of medicinal herbs. He created a ministry for the care of the aborigines and subject races of India. He made provisions for the education of women. He made vast benefactions to the Buddhist teaching orders and tried to stimulate them to a better and more energetic criticism of their own accumulated literature. For corruptions and superstitious accretions had accumulated very speedily upon the pure and simple teaching of the great Indian master. Missionaries went from Ashoka to Kashmir, to Persia, to Ceylon, and Alexandria. In the picture you can see the transom showing of the court of Ashoka in the India Museum. And in this second picture you can see Ashoka panel from Harhut in the India Museum. Such was Ashoka, greatest of kings. He was far in advance of his age. He left no prince and no organization of men to carry on his work, and within a century of his death, the great days of his reign had become a glorious memory in a shattered and decaying India. The priestly caste of the Brahmins, the highest and most privileged caste in the Indian social body, has always been opposed to the frank and opening teaching of Buddha. Gradually, they undermined the Buddhist influence in the land. The all monstrous gods, the innumerable cults of Hinduism resumed their sway. Past became more rigorous and complicated. For long centuries, Buddhism and Brahminism flourished side by side. And then slowly Buddhism decayed and Brahminism, in a multitude of forms, replaced it. But beyond the confines of India and the realms of caste, Buddhism spread, until it had won China and Siam, and Burma and Japan, countries in which it is predominant to this day. In the picture you can see the Pillar of Lions, capital of the pillar, column lying on side, erected in Deer Park in the time of Ashoka, where Buddha preached his first sermon, from a print in the India Museum. End of chapter. Chapter number 30, Confucius and Lao Tse. We have still to tell of two other great men, Confucius and Lao Tse, who lived in that wonderful century which began the adolescence of mankind, the 6th century BC. In this history, thus far we have told very little of the early story of China. Present, that early history is still very obscure, and we look to Chinese explorers and archaeologists in the new China that is now arising to work out their past as thoroughly as the European past has been worked out during the last century. Very long ago, the first primitive Chinese civilizations arose in the great rivers valleys out of the primordial Paleolithic culture. They had, like Egypt and Sumeria, the great characteristics of that culture, and they center upon temples in which priests and priest kings offer the seasonal blood sacrifices. The life in those cities must have been very like the Egyptian and Sumerian life of 6 or 7,000 years ago, and very like the Maya life of the Central America 1,000 years ago. If there were human sacrifices, they had long given way to animal sacrifices before the dawn of history, and a form of picture writing was growing up long before 1,000 years BC. And just as the primitive civilizations of Europe and Western Asia were in conflict with the nomads of the desert, the nomads of the north, so the primitive Chinese civilizations had a great cloud of nomadic peoples on their northern borders. There was a number of tribes keen in language and ways of living who are spoken of in history in succession as the Huns, the Mongols, Turks, and Tartars. They changed and divided and combined and recombined, just as the Nordic peoples in North Europe and Central Asia changed and varied in name rather than in nature. These Mongolian nomads had horses earlier than the Nordic peoples, and it may be that in the region of the Altai Mountains they made an independent discovery of iron somewhen after 1000 BC. And just as in the Western case, so ever and again these Eastern nomads would achieve a sort of political unity and become the conquerors and masters and revivers of this or that settled and civilized region. It is quite possible that the early civilization of China was not Mongolian at all, any more than the earliest civilization of Europe was Western Asia, than the earliest civilization of Europe and Eastern Asia was Nordic or Semitic. It is quite possible that the earliest civilization of China was a brunette civilization and of a piece with the earliest Egyptian, Sumerian, and Dravidian civilization, and that when the first recorded history of China began, there had already been conquests and intermixture. At any rate, we find that by 1750 BC, China was already a vast system of little kingdoms and city-states, all acknowledging a loose allegiance and paying more or less regularly, more or less definite feudal dues to one great priest's emperor, or the Son of Heaven. The Shang dynasty came to an end in 1125 BC. A Chao dynasty succeeded Shang and maintained China in a relaxing unity until the days of Asoka in India and of the Ptolemies in Egypt. Gradually, China went to pieces during that long Chao period. Hunnish peoples came down and set up principalities. Local rulers discontinued their tribute and became independent. There was in the 6th century BC. There was in the 6th century BC, says one Chinese authority, 5 or 6,000 practically independent states in China. It was what the Chinese call in their records an age of confusion. But this age of confusion was compatible with much intellectual activity and with the existence of many local centers of art and civilized living. When we know more of Chinese history, we shall find that China also had her Miletus and her Athens, her Pergamum and her Macedonia. At present, we must be vague and brief about this period of Chinese division simply because our knowledge is not sufficient for us to frame a coherent and consecutive history. In the picture, you can see Confucius, copy of stone carving in the temple of Confucius at Hufu, from the records of the archaeological mission to North China, Chauvins. And just as in divided Greece there were philosophers and in shattered and captive Jewry prophets, So in disordered China, there were philosophers and teachers at this time. In all these cases, insecurity and uncertainty seem to have quickened the better sort of mind. Confucius was a man of aristocratic origin and some official importance in a small state called Lu. Here, in a very parallel mode to the Greek impulse, he set up a sort of academy for discovering and teaching wisdom. The lawlessness and disorder of China distressed him profoundly. He conceived an ideal of a better government and a better life, traveled from state to state seeking a prince who would carry out his legislative and educational ideas. He never found his prince. He found a prince, but core intrigues undermined the influence of the teacher and finally defeated his reforming proposals. It is interesting to note that a century and a half later, the Greek philosopher Platon also sought a prince and was for a time advisor to the tyrant Dionysius, who ruled Syracuse in Sicily. Confucius died a disappointed man. No intelligent ruler arises to take me as his master, he said, and my time has come to die. But his teaching had more vitality than he imagined in his declining and hopeless years, and it became a great formative influence with the Chinese people. It became one of what the Chinese call the three teachings, the other two being those of Buddha and Lao Tse. The gist of the teaching of Confucius was the way of the noble or aristocratic man. He was concerned with personal conduct as much as Gautama was concerned with the peace of self-forgetfulness, and the Greek with external knowledge, and the Jew with righteousness. He was the most public-minded of all great teachers. He was supremely concerned by the confusion and miseries of the world, and he wanted to make men noble in order to bring out a noble world. He sought to regulate conduct to an extraordinary extent, to provide sound rules for every occasion in life. A polite, public-spirited gentleman, rather sternly self-disciplined, was the ideal he found already developing in the northern Chinese world, and one to which he gave a permanent form. In the picture you can see the Great Wall of China as it crosses the mountains in Manchuria. Photo by Underwood and Underwood. The teaching of Lao Tse, who was for a long time in charge of the imperial library of the Zhou dynasty, was more mystical and vague and elusive than that of Confucius. He seems to have preached a stoical indifference to the pleasures and powers of the world, and a return to an imaginary simple life of the past. He left writings very contacted in style and very obscure. He wrote in riddles. After his death, his teachings, like the teachings of Gautama Buddha, were corrupted and overlaid by legends and had the most complex and extraordinary observances and superstitious ideas grafted upon them. In China, just as in India, primordial ideas of magic and monstrous legends out of the childish past of our race struggle against the new thinking in the world and succeeded in plastering it over with grotesque, irrational, and antiquated observances. Both Buddhism and Taoism, which ascribes itself largely to Lao Tse, as one finds them in China now, are religions of monk, temple, priest, and offering of a type, as an ancient in form, if not in thought, as the sacrificial religions of ancient Sumeria and Egypt. But the teaching of Confucius was not so overlaid, because it was limited and plain and straightforward and lent itself to no such distortions. But the teaching of Confucius was not so overlaid, because it was limited and plain and straightforward and lent itself to no such distortions. In the picture you can see an early Chinese bronze bell, inscribed in archaic characters, made for use by the elder of Hing village in Ting district. latter half of the Zhou dynasty, 6th century BC, in the Victoria and Albert Museum. North China, the China of the Huanghe River, became Confucian in thought and spirit. South China, Yao Tse-kiang China, became Taoist. Since those days, a conflict has been traceable in Chinese affairs between these two spirits, the spirit of the North and the spirit of the South, between, in latter times, Peking and Nanking, between the official-minded, upright, and conservative North and the skeptical, artistic, lax, and experimental South. The divisions of China of the Age of Confucian reached their worst stage in the 6th century BC. The Zhou dynasty was so enfeebled and so discredited that Lao Tse left the unhappy court and retired into private life. Three nominally subordinate powers dominated the situation in those days: Xi and Xin, both northern powers, and Chu, which was an aggressive military power in the Yangtze Valley. At last, Xi and Xin formed an alliance, subdued Ku, and imposed a general treaty of disarmament and peace in China. The power of Xin became predominant. Finally, about the time of Asoka in India, the Xin monarch seized upon the sacrificial vessels of the Zhou emperor and took over his sacrificial duties. His son, Shi Huangti, king in 246 BC and emperor in 220 BC, is called in the Chinese chronicles the first universal emperor. More fortunate than Alexander, Shi Huangti reigned for 36 years as king and emperor. His energetic reign marks the beginning of a new era of unity and prosperity for the Chinese people. He fought vigorously against the Hunnish invaders from the northern deserts, and he began that immense work, the Great Wall of China, to set a limit to their incursions. End of chapter.